And then my mother did teach piano and a reed organ, and played the organ, the pipe organ, until she was 80 years old. So I would say that it is a combination of these two things that made me become very interested in pursuing the art of music and the art of organ building further.
You started as a technician in manufacturing at the Moeller Organ Company?
It was required that you serve an apprenticeship for 5 years, which I did.
As I understand it, you were involved in the building of the artiste reproducing organ and also, what was it, the solo symphonist?
Yes, that is correct. As a matter of fact, in 1924, I was involved in the playing mechanism of the solo symphonist, which, while it was called a player organ, it was not automatic in that it did not register the stops, the expression, the crescendo, sforzando, and so forth. It merely played the notes. And I was so proud of the fact that I was involved in that early beginning that I went out and I had cards made. At that time, I didn't know where I was going to be. I didn't know where or what. We didn't have telephones that day. I thought perhaps we would sometime. I was so proud that I rushed out and had cards made. Victor I. Zuck, solo symphonist, assembler, and builder. And then that led into the automatic reproducing organ, of which I spent many, many years.
That first the artiste?
That was the artiste, was the trade name for the Moeller reproducing pipe organ. 100% automatic.
I see. Now, at that time, do I understand you developed a roll-making process for Moeller?
Well, I was involved in the roll-making process. There were so many at that time. I'm sure that you have seen many of the roll-making processes that were used in piano rolls. Well, the pipe organ used similar methods. One, of course, was the pens who marked the paper as the artist performed. The other was a punching machine which punched as he played. The system that I was involved in was entirely different, and the reason it was different was the fact that we felt that since only 90%, about 90% of the world's music is organ music, that we should get into the symphonic and the orchestral transcriptions. And this is what made this automatic player unique, in that our library was primarily an orchestral and symphonic library, as well as the standard organ recordings.
I see. How was the coding then put on the roll? The roll-making machine punched the note holes in, but did it do anything in the way of putting in expression holes at that time, or were they put in later?
The one system which we called the autographic system was where, and I remember Edwin Lemaire was one who made a recording, his famous Andantino, where that system was used. And I would say that only 1/3 of the records we made were of the autographic type. That is, the organist played and the machine automatically perforated the music roll to make the master. And that included expression, the pneumatics to record the stops, the couplers, and all of the other mechanism that was required. That, as I said, represented 1/3 of our roll making. But the system which was the best, we thought, and of course this was evidenced by the tremendous response from organists and conductors throughout the United States, was the system of using a Moeller transcriber or rhythm nuancer. It was like a telegraph key. The organist did not need to play a note. He merely sat at the console with the manuscript before him. He would press this key, the rhythm as expressed, and it'd sort of sing the piece through. This key, when depressed, would mark the tape. This tape was similar to an adding machine tape, maybe 3/4 of an inch in width, and he had nothing to bother about. He had page turning, but that was very simple. He didn't need to use his hands for the stops or the feet. He didn't need to play a note. He merely did the nuancing on this tape record. Then the nuancing tape was taken to the master roll cutting room. And there, and I'm sure that you're familiar with the stencil cutting of a master roll. This we did. Our master rolls were 3 feet in width, and a whole note would be maybe 3 inches long by 5/16 of an inch wide. Along beside, then our musicians who did the punching, marking, and then the punching, would of course have this nuancing tape beside them as they marked the music prior to the cutting. And in this way, we didn't have mistakes that way. Or if we had mistakes, it was in the man who was marking the master, and this we could correct. You may have some other questions later on to ask me about this system. But basically, that was a system, a very simple system, and a very superior system, we felt.
As I recall, was this about 1926?
This was in it started in 1925, but in 1926 we really began to get into it very, very deeply.
Was this when you were working with Frederick Hoschke?
Yes, Professor Hoschke, whom you might know, was one of the AMICA artists.
One of the early artists, I recall,
early artists.
The arithmetic rolls.
Yes, he was. And he was interested, of course, not only in the making of organ rolls and playing for AMICA, but he had also made discs for music boxes, the big zinc discs. He made them, and he was also a great composer, had written and had conducted many symphonies throughout the world, and he became musical director, and much of my tutelage was under Professor Hush.
He was musical director at Moeller.
At Moeller.
I see.
At Moeller.
That's very interesting.
Prior to that time, he was president of the Springfield Conservatory of Music in Springfield, Massachusetts.
As I recall, you and he became interested in electronic tonal reproduction and left Moeller and went with Everett to develop a new type of instrument?
That is correct.
What was that called?
Well, that was called, it wasn't called anything, really, when it left Hagerstown, but later on it was trademarked Orgatron.
You didn't have any pet names for it?
Well, pipeless pipe organ, I guess, would be the most familiar title for it. But that was developed in Hagerstown, was taken to the Everett Piano Company, and that may sound strange, taking an organ to an electronic organ, especially to a piano company. But that was because the Everett Piano Company had absorbed the Howard Radio Company of Chicago. So we had the facilities there. This wasn't just a piano manufacturing plant, this was a radio manufacturing plant. So the electronic part became quite simple, and with the expertise that was there, why, we were in production within a relatively short time.
Well, now what happened to the Orgatron? How come it didn't become popular and sell? And it didn't have much of a market, as I recall, did it?
Oh, it had a very good market.
Yeah.
Oh yes, it had a very good market. It came out about the same time. It was the second electronic organ, Hammond being the first. And, they were made in, I guess, 10,000, I believe. And most of the Everett dealers, who were Steinway dealers throughout the United States, had it.
I see.
And then when the war came along, of course, manufacturing was stopped, and nothing happened until after the war. But during that period, the rights, the patent rights and all, were sold to the Wurlitzer Company in North Tonawanda, New York. And then it was manufactured under the name Wurlitzer organ.
Are there any available now, to your knowledge? Have they been restored as other instruments, to your knowledge?
Well, the electronic organs?
Yes.
Well,
the Orgatron, particularly.
Oh, yes, they're still available. They're still available. As a matter of fact, I saw one advertised in the instrument catalog. I believe that we're going on a tour there tomorrow to their museum. There's one there that is for sale, I noticed, and at a very good price. Oh, yes, they're still in use in many churches throughout the United States.
You had the patents on this?
Had the basic patents.
You had a number of patents, didn't you?
Well, yes, we had the basic patents in France, Germany, and Belgium, and the United States, of course, on the tone-producing system. I won't get into that unless you would like to know that system as it compared with some of the other systems, but it was unique in that we used natural harmonics throughout, and quite a good organ, and I mean a good electronic organ, because it more faithfully sounded like the true pipe organ.
Well, now you were briefly then with Wurlitzer when they took over this
Yes.
mechanism.
They asked me to come with them to direct development and engineering,
I see.
and later on production.
I see. You were head of production then for a while of this organ. And then you returned to Moeller, as I recall, didn't you?
Well, really, I'd never left Moeller. In a way, yes, but I always felt closely associated, because during the intervening years, from the time I left Moeller in 1936 till I returned in 1952, I had been doing consulting work for them in the areas where I would be. For instance, South Haven, Michigan, it was Chicago, and in that area. And then in Buffalo, New York, or rather Tonawanda, New York, or North Tonawanda, it was Buffalo. And so I started I had my first office in Buffalo before going to Pittsburgh.
And you remained there with Moeller in what, research and selling and marketing?
Mainly in designing and selling.
I see.
Of course, I did have an installation crew and a service organization, so we did everything in Pittsburgh.
One of the interesting things, I think, Victor, since you're our newest honorary member, is the fact that in 1975 you were ordained an Episcopal minister. And I guess you're currently the minister at St. Luke's Church in what is it, Georgetown?
Georgetown, Pennsylvania.
That's an interesting change of career, if I may say so. Would you mind my asking what brought this about?
Well, of course, I started for the ministry, studying for the diaconate, before I retired from Moeller. Moeller had no compulsory retirement, but I did retire at 66 from Moeller. But prior to that time, I had been studying. I had a mentor, private mentor, and I took the examinations, equivalent to a 3-year seminary course, the same examination that every person coming out of a divinity school or a theological school has to take. I took the examinations and passed, but I don't think I've quite answered your question. I'd always had an interest in religion. I consider myself fairly religious all my life. I came from a family of ministers. My uncle was the founder of Juniata College at Huntington, which was a Church of the Brethren school, and he was a minister. So I'd never forgotten that, and I felt that I had been so blessed throughout my life that I thought that in my later years I would like to share some of those blessings with others. And I thought that the ministry would be one of the best ways that I could serve my Lord and serve mankind and still never forget the organ player business.
You certainly contributed a great deal, first in the musical field and the mechanical instrument field, and now in the religious field. You have at home, as I understand it, developed a roll-cutting registration machine. Could you describe briefly how that works? How does it differ from the original one that you worked on?
Well, I might say that the reason I have one is that I have a reproducing organ in my home with approximately 400 recordings. And these I've gathered up from all over the world. I have a player which I had built in 1934, and it was originally built for a funeral home, and the library was quite limited. And I didn't want to listen to hymns and mortuary records all my life, so I collected as many rolls as I could. Some of the rolls would be from 4 manual pipe organs, some from 3, and some from only 2. Well, this is where our process differed again. Every roll was custom cut for a particular organ because every organ was different.
Is that so?
So, for instance, we built an organ for a player organ for Pacific Beach Club right at Long Beach. And if they would send in and want a box staccato in D minor, why, we would registrate that roll for their organ, not take one off of the shelf as a standard roll and say, well, here it is. So, I have this recording machine. I do not know whether you can take a picture of this or not, but it is a machine that I put in a rectangular slot, not unlike in fact, it is a computer slot, exactly the same size. And this, starting from left to right, will bring on the couplers, will bring on the stops, will bring on the grand crescendo, will cancel the tremulants if they need to be canceled, and will do a number of things that is almost impossible for an organist to do. Now, that's only an organ record.
Is this the only one of its kind?
No, there are a couple of them, but I say a couple, there are exactly two of them to my knowledge, and I have the one, and I built this one for Bay City, Michigan. We could talk, I guess, a long, long time, but when we first started out, we had records. We had no way to cut them in the factory. We had some player organs installed, and one was in the Lark Administration Building, Buffalo, New York, and one was in the Masonic Temple in Bay City, Michigan. So they shipped the registration machine out to me, and I registrated all the rolls on the job. And one selection, or a symphonic number, let us say, Stradello Overture, something like that, may have as many as 69 different combinations, which meant that 69 stops had to be made on this machine to perforate or to cut the automatic slots.
Well, does this mean then that different organ rolls then would sound differently, play differently, one from another? Because after all, man can be fallible in doing the coding. If you're registering one day and then later on do it for another organ, isn't it possible that you might code one a little differently than the other?
Well, they would be coded differently. For instance, we were on the 5th floor of the museum yesterday, and there was an automatic player, not connected up, not operating, of course, that I built for the Waldorf Astoria in New York City, the new Waldorf Astoria Hotel. Well, the new Waldorf Hotel had a 4-manual pipe organ. And let us say the solo division had a French horn, which it did. So the Pilgrim's Chorus, let us say, which starts out with French horn, we would cut in the French horn.
I see.
We would come to a smaller instrument, the Pacific Coast Club that I mentioned, would not have a French horn. So we would add a diapason, which is the fundamental organ stop. We would add a flute to synthetically produce the French horn. That is what we had to do. So every organ was different. We kept on file every specification. So it wasn't difficult. It was time-consuming, but it wasn't difficult.
Oh, that's an amazing job. Wonderful. Tell us a little bit about the organ you have at home, which is quite unique. I think you have a photograph of it.
Yes, I have built this organ. It is 18 ranks at present, with 3 more being prepared for. It's very complete, and as you can see by the picture, it has an unenclosed great division. This is the way all European organs are built, were built, and of course most of the American organs are built this way today. We have the great organ, and behind that we have the swell organ, which is enclosed with a set of louvers. Now, basically from the organ console that you see, only a true organ sound can be obtained by the stop controls. By that I mean the classical organ sound. Then the player, for the player mechanism, it will draw on the romantic stops, which I would be criticized for in bringing in Mr. Heinz Wunderlich from St. Jacobi Church, who has played in our home. If I would have a French horn, and if I would have a tibia clausa or tibia plena, why, he just wouldn't use them, and he would say, what kind of an organ builder is Victor Zuck? So, from the console, it is strictly a classical organ, but the automatic player will bring on the romantic stops, and of course the other organ tones as well, which makes it quite complete and quite extraordinary. In addition to that, a person seated at the console who wishes to have the romantic sounds, the orchestral sounds, he will slip in a computer card on the right-hand side, and that's the only way that he can bring on those stops. So he is not limited, but he needs some help sometimes for somebody to operate the computer for him and there, of course, it's endless. The combinations are just endless.
Sounds like a wonderful thing. You have some other musical instruments too, I believe.
Yes, I have, in automatic instruments, I have a beautiful Welty Mignon that was built in Germany.
The red rolls.
The red, yes, the red rolls, which are very difficult to get, but I have over 100 of them. And some of the artists I heard performed during this convention, I have some of their autographed rolls, and I'm so proud that I got to meet them and have them autograph their pictures for me.
Sounds great. As I recall, too, you had some materials that you turned over to the Smithsonian Institution. What was the nature of those?
Well, I guess it goes back a little before that. People having found out that I had built a number, hundreds and hundreds of automatic reproducing organs, that is either under my supervision or in the early days by myself personally, they would contact me to find out where these were all installed. So they started collecting them from all over the United States, and even Winnipeg, Manitoba, and Japan, and wherever one would be available. So I had a listing of all of them, and I would send them out to these inquirers, and then they in turn would get one. Maybe it didn't work. They didn't know how to get it to work. The tubing would be disintegrated, and I would send them what materials I had. And I felt that, well, then I had an inquiry from the Smithsonian Institute. Did I have any drawing, any tracker bar layout, or switching schematics? So I sent what I had, and they have reproduced them.
Oh, it's very interesting. And this brings me around to our other guest, Gary Sturm, who is the collections manager of the musical instrument division. And Gary, in looking over some of your personal background before we start talking about the institution, you remind me of what I used to call a mixed-up kid. You've done so many things to finally end up at the institution. As I understand it, you graduated from college, in the late 60s. You majored in mathematics.
Right.
You then went on abroad and studied music and art history. Where, Copenhagen, was it?
That's right, yes.
But then, in addition to that, you are a licensed automobile mechanic, you're a licensed airplane pilot, you're a licensed ice dancer?
Yes.
Is that appropriate? You play in a string band, and for a period of years you even made violins. For four or 5 years, was it? How come all of these different interests in your background?
Well, first of all, I don't do all of those things at once. That would be quite impossible. But it's just as I was growing older, there were things that I've always wanted to do. And just having the chance to start out and see how they go. And some of them are related. The studies in Copenhagen led to my interest in violin making. When I came back to the United States, then I did find a violin maker that would work with me. And then, because of financial reasons, that became pretty impossible, so I took a job as the manager of an art gallery. And
that's right.
With my background in history.
1974, you went with, what, the David Art Gallery in Washington, D.C.?
That's right.
And that was just prior to joining the Smithsonian Institution, wasn't it?
That's right. And I was very fortunate at that time because when I went to the Smithsonian to present them with myself and my skills. They were just preparing for the bicentennial celebration in 1975, getting ready for 1976, so they desperately needed help. I volunteered there for almost a full year and then was offered a job.
As I understand, you went into the conservation lab. Now, what does that mean, conservation?
Well, there are several ideas of how people approach conservation today, and at the Smithsonian what we try to do is to preserve what's original to the instruments as much as possible, so that it makes a lot of work much more difficult. You wouldn't just strip all of the finish off of an instrument, for example, to bring it back to life. You keep what's original and try to work around that. So when I went there, I had skills as a woodworker from my violin making, and then I received further training in how one does this very particular type of work where you're trying to copy what somebody has done before you, which is really very difficult. It's much different from creating your own from the beginning. And so the conservation has to do with preserving what's there and then also trying to repair what damage has been done.
Well, you certainly have an inquiring mind, and I can see how this background has developed your interest in that. And of course, this is one reason, I guess, why the Smithsonian Institution was conferred honorary membership, the fact that your division of musical instrument preserves, displays, restores, and operates the automatic musical instruments you have.
Right.
Now, in your collection at the institution, about how many automatic musical instruments are there now?
There are about 150 to 200.
All in operating condition?
About 10% are actually playable, but that represents quite a lot in terms of the staff that we have to maintain what we do, and also there's a lot of duplication, so that it isn't necessarily a priority to restore 10 of the same thing. We'll take one example and fix that up, and so people can see what that.
How large a staff do you have to do restoration and maintenance?
Well, at the moment we have one person working in conservation and a staff of 5 altogether.
I see.
Which is not a large number of people.
What some of the types of instruments can you recall that you have there? Tell us what some of the major items are.
Sure. The Division of Musical Instruments is most known for its collection of keyboard instruments, and probably of most interest to people in this organization. That's a nice thing to have. And we have, well, we are one of the top 3 in the world of numbers of keyboard instruments, and in terms of the range of the history and the development of the keyboards, we have instruments from early virginals and clavichords through the harpsichord, early pianos, and now we're especially interested in collecting as much of American culture as possible. We'd like to have as many American makers, and in that line what we have, which are of interest to us, are early Chickering pianos. We have a Chickering Square from 1850, which has been restored and recorded, and it's been used at the White House for performances. We have a Steinway piano from 1853, which was number 1199. It's a straight-strung Steinway. It's a fantastic rosewood instrument. And we have Paderewski's Steinway that was built in 1893 that he used on tour when he was in the United States, and he signed the soundboard of that.
What about the automatic musical instruments?
Yeah. In that we have a range of things, and the things that do work I might mention, and I think earlier you mentioned a show of the automatic music machines, which the Smithsonian presented in 1971. That exhibit was up for a couple of years and has since been taken down, but at that time a lot of work was done, and that's why Victor was contacted, in fact, because there was this machine that nobody knew what was going on, so we needed some.
Do you have a Moeller automatic organ?
Well, in fact, there was one I found out that was on loan for just that exhibit, and it doesn't belong to the Smithsonian, so it's since been returned.
Would you like to have one?
Certainly, certainly.
Maybe this is a project we ought to work on.
Yeah.
What about some of the other instruments? You have an Ampico, I know.
Yeah.
Have a Duart?
No, we don't. We'd
have
like
a Welty?
Last week we've gotten a Welty Philharmonic organ, and it's something we've been working on for a year, and the deal was just closed before I came out here to the meetings. We also have a large collection of cylinder boxes, and a George Hicks barrel organ from 1850 from New York. We have a Violano Virtuoso from the Mills Novelty Company, which was made, I didn't know this again, until I was preparing to come out here, apparently the company especially made a violano virtuoso for the Smithsonian to be presented as an example of their product. And so we have that works quite well.
What instruments in particular are you interested in acquiring?
Well, right now what we'd like to get are we'd like to get a Duo Art Steinway. Yeah, and also we do not have a Chickering grand piano, and those two things are rather major holes in the line of the type of instruments we'd like to show representing the history, especially of American manufacturing.
I see. Let's talk a little bit about the history of the Smithsonian Institution. I know only a little. I know that because you were organized back in, August of 1846, you are certainly AMICA's oldest honorary member. And another thing I know, of course, is that there was an English scientist named James Smithson who gave money to this country. He was an Englishman. He gave money to this country to disseminate knowledge among people. Now,
That's right.
Why would an Englishman give money to the United States for this purpose? Why didn't he give it to England?
Well, in fact, I think he had decided that already in England there were too many people pursuing different specialized areas of study. And I think also one of his criteria was that he was looking for a young, adventurous country.
Underdeveloped country in the sense it's used today?
Uncivilized, right. Where something like this could be used to expand yet more. And I think that in Europe he found that with the history of that continent and in England, already there was a sense of all of that going on. And so he wanted to establish something new and exciting. And in fact, he first presented the idea to the Smithsonian. It took Congress many years to decide to accept it because it was a very big responsibility. It wasn't just accepting, I think the original grant was for $500,000, which was a considerable sum.
$500,000?
Right. And which, isn't that much. And what it represented was a very big responsibility to maintain the original idea, which was, in Smithson's words, to increase and diffuse knowledge among men. And so
he put no limits on it. Just as long as you increased and diffused knowledge, that was
essentially, yeah. And so the initial grant was spent to design at that time was the only Smithsonian building now called the Castle. And throughout the years, the federal government, I might say that makes the Smithsonian also very unique in that it's funded by the federal government, but at the same time we can accept private donations. And so we're a museum that enjoys a nice resource for money and objects. But at any rate, the federal government then spent, over the years, a large amount of money to create new buildings to house different parts of the collection. And, in fact, an example of the private sector is just recently the Mellon family built an entire new wing for the National Gallery, and that cost a lot of money for them.
Gary, I'd be interested in having you describe perhaps the viewpoint of the institution towards this musical instrument collection. We have in AMICA, as you know, people who play, people who enjoy music, people who like to restore instruments, people who like to do antique collecting.
Right.
Tell us about the philosophy or viewpoint of the institution.
Well, I'd say primarily what we're trying to do, if you were looking over the long range, is to preserve a segment of American culture. And at the same time, there's a very strong philosophy that has come into the division of musical instruments just in the past 10 or 15 years, where we feel very strongly that instruments should not just be in a display case, but they should be heard. And in fact, there was, before the 1960s, there was not even a division of musical instruments. The instrument collection was just part of the anthropology department of the Smithsonian. So we're very active. Our philosophy is that the instruments should be heard. They should be preserved as an original state as possible. And sometimes those two ideas conflict. An instrument may not always be in a state where you can restore it without doing something to it. But on the other hand, when it can be played, and also recordings are a very big part of that, so as many people as possible can hear what those things sound like.
Last time I was at the institution, I picked up a copy of Music Machines American Style,
Right.
and I think it's a wonderful publication. Does it still exist?
Yes, in fact, we still have some copies that we had thought the publication had been sold out, and,
All right.
and then we uncovered back in the corner 3 boxes of the catalog, so it can still be had.
100 or so left?
I believe that's about right. Yeah.
Certainly a collector's item.
Yeah.
It's beautifully
Also,
done.
if you don't have it, we have a little 45 RPM record of that goes along with it that has some of the sounds of the exhibit.
Victor, you've seen the collection at the Smithsonian. What would you think could be done to improve it there, besides putting in a Moeller automatic organ?
Well, I am ashamed to say that I haven't seen the exhibit.
Well, I'm afraid that there are an awful lot of Amicans that have not been there, and they really have missed something. And it's a well worth exhibit, and I hope you can maintain the instruments. One of the things I was a little bit concerned when I was there was that you allow people to touch and even manipulate or operate some of these instruments, and as a result, that does some damage.
That's strictly by supervision, and it's not everyone who comes through the Smithsonian is allowed to do that.
Have you roped off the machines now?
Right. And also, I might add, in relationship to people coming to visit, in that if you do have a special interest, a lot of times things will not be on exhibit that you might be interested in seeing.
Are you saying that if Amicans come, they should ask
Make an
for you?
appointment ahead of
Make an
time.
appointment
And we can show them things that are in the storage
things that are
areas
in the back room.
that the general public may not get to see.
Well, this could be of great interest to our collectors, because many of them are trying to restore instruments, and there just isn't the
Yeah.
know-how available. It hasn't been written down. It hasn't been preserved in any way. And if they could see an old machine.
Exactly.
Well, I think you felt yesterday, didn't you, Victor, when you saw that part of a Moeller organ, was it, at the Nethercutt collection, that there was something that they probably didn't know how to restore. They'd need some expert help to do it.
Yes, although they do have a man, I don't know whether he's on their staff, but a man who is available to them that I have worked with, and I've given him a lot of information on how to restore one. I might mention, you asked if I had been to the Smithsonian, or assumed that I had been. I was to the Greenfield Village Museum. Now, they have quite a collection, too. I have been there, and I have helped them in finding someone even to refurbish their Aeolian organ. The one building there, or the church building where Henry Ford and his wife were married, of course he moved the whole building there, he moved the organ there, and the organ had a player on it, so they didn't know how to get it operating, so I am proud that I could lend a hand there in helping them restore that.
Well, you two gentlemen have been wonderful to chat with me this afternoon, and I appreciate very much Victor Zuck, and you, Gary Sturm, for coming. Thank you very much on behalf of AMICA.
It has been a pleasure.
All right, I can only
Thank
second
you.
that.
Good.
Certainly.
All right, we're up.
Hey, how about that?
That's good.
Now, another 5 minutes and it's the other room.
You think we're gonna move it that quick?
Thanks ever so much.
You're not.